Perdidos somos, oh Señor, ayúdanos a encaminar. Injusticias habrá, Señor, dolor y amargura. Todos los mineros, Señor, buscaremos la justicia. Explotados y maltratados, ayúdanos, Señor. Apiádate, oh mi Señor, del pueblo minero. Humildemente te pedimos salvación, liberación.
Welcome to the podcast of Weaving the Blanket, Stories of Faith, Sacrifice, Martyrdom, and the Emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church of Bolivia. I am David Stevenson. Last week we learned about this mine high in the Andes, which produced an incredible amount of silver. So much silver it increased the standard of living of the average person in the world. Its coins became the first international currency, and it funded the Industrial Revolution in Europe. No other mine has ever impacted the entire globe like Cerro Rico. But this week we're going to look at the dark side of Cerro Rico. While Europeans called it the envy of kings, the locals, even today, call it the mountain that eats men. So why is Bolivia the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere? Where did all that wealth go? Well, of course, first and foremost, the incredible wealth from Cerro Rico went to the Spanish crown and to the Catholic Church. The opulent colonialist buildings in Spain and the gold and silver Roman Catholic altars of Spain and Rome show that most of it went to Spain and to the Church. The Spanish government gave the rights to mine in Bolivia to only a very few chosen families, and they lived in Spain. But their children and their managers, they lived in incredible luxury in Potosi, which in the 16th century was the richest city in the Western Hemisphere. When Simón Bolívar brought independence from Spain in 1825, the wealth stayed somewhat more local. The mines were still controlled by a very few families, but it was the Bolivian government, not the Spanish government, who received the taxes. Thus you have the opulent buildings and the incredible haciendas of Sucre, Bolivia, which at the time was the national capital. But with the coming of independence and the increased speed and economics of transportation, the gold and silver industries followed the lead of every other major mining industry and simply extracted the extremely valuable resource and exported it to other countries for refining, leaving Bolivia with virtually nothing to show for its mineral wealth, although the Casa de Moneda in Potosi continued to mint coins all the way up until the 1950s. While the Bolivian government made money from its taxation on the mines, the Bolivian families that owned the mines gathered great wealth, and their top management lived in great luxury. But make no mistake about it, the wealth was for the elite, the descendants of the conquistadors, the criollo, and not for the people. Even those who were actually creating this incredible wealth, the miners themselves, had miserable working and living conditions. At first, the miners were Aymara and mainly Quechua slaves, and later the indentured servants of the Mitanni, captured by the conquistadors for the sole purpose of working in the mine. The mining techniques were horrible, even by 16th and 17th century European standards. Tens of thousands died from cave-ins, accidents, and silicosis pneumonia. In order to increase productivity, in 1572, the Spanish Viceroy of Toledo instituted the Ley de la Mita, which required all indigenous and African slaves over the age of 18 to work in shifts of 12 hours. They would remain underground without seeing daylight for as much as 4 months at a time, eating, sleeping, working deep in the mine for 4 months. When they emerged from their 4-month shift, Their eyes were covered to prevent damage from the bright sunlight. These miners, who became known as the Mitios, didn't last very long. The death rate increased, and thousands more died from mercury poisoning while working in the smelting mills, since the only way to extract the silver involved contact with deadly mercury. The conquistador mindset was, if you are using half-human heathens as your miners, why waste good money on such things as safety equipment and reinforced mine shafts? By 1600, so many indigenous people around Potosi had been rounded up and made into slaves and then died inside Cerro Rico that it was beginning to dangerously depopulate the countryside. Consequently, the mine owners petitioned the Spanish crown to get permission to import 2,000 African slaves a year. Spain had already banned slavery, yet they made an exception for these mine owners. An estimated total of 30,000 African slaves were taken Potosi during the colonial era, and like the native laborers, they too died in large numbers. African slaves were forced to work in the Casa de la Moneda, the House of Money, or the Mint, at Potosi. They worked as human mules. Mules were originally used to push the great wheels which provided the power to run the silver mills. However, the mules were not well adapted to do this heavy labor at this altitude, and most of the mules died quickly. So the colonialists replaced the 4 mules with 20 African slaves. It was much cheaper to replace a slave than to replace a mule. The best estimates made by today's scholars is that during the time of the colonial rule, from 1545 to 1825, over 8 million indigenous slaves and serfs and almost all of the 30,000 African slaves died. I did the math. That is an incredible 78 deaths a day, every day, for 280 years. Think about that. 78 deaths every day for 280 years. And there are some recent historians who think that number is too low. Cerro Rico became locally known as the mountain that eats men. Untold more people have died from the incredibly polluted water laced with arsenic, lead, cadmium, zinc, and other pollutants which flow out of the mountain. And even today, this water is used for irrigation and animal watering farther downstream. After 1826, the Criollo patrons of Bolivia, the wealthy descendants of the conquistadors, still owned the mines. They used not the slavery of before, but a form of conscripted labor which required the peones or the peons, the indigenous people of particular areas that had been assigned to a particular patron. These peons were required to work for free. And other miners came from the Quechua and Aymaras who were simply looking for any kind of work. The treatment of these miners were inhuman. They were kept in squalor and horrible living conditions. And while not quite slavery, it was a horrible form of serfdom which led to a lifespan of 35 to 45 years old and a terrifying infant mortality rate. There is one great story about one Quechua who outsmarted the system. He worked in the mines. His job was to push the silver ore in these heavy, heavy carts up from the depths of the mines to the surface. But the man was constantly looking at his cargo as he pushed the cart toward the surface. He was looking for small, nearly pure nuggets of silver. And when he found one of the right size and shape, he would secretly swallow the nugget. That night, he would dig through his poo, clean it up, and hide the silver. After a couple of years of this, one day he just didn't show up for work. The mine supervisors just assumed that he had died like so many others during the night. His family suddenly vanished. Supposedly, he moved down to Santa Cruz where it's warm all the time. instead of the cold of Potosi, and he built himself a large and beautiful home in Santa Cruz and lived happily ever after. But for every other miner, this job was and is hell. While we're talking about the mines at Cerro Rico, I'm going to jump ahead to what is happening there today. Cerro Rico is no longer mined by the big mining companies. It's mined by small mining cooperatives. These, I believe, are either totally owned by Indigenous cooperative members or at least primarily by Indigenous cooperative members. I'm not sure if there are any cooperatives that are run by mestizos or not. However, now that Cerro Rico is mined by the Indigenous themselves, from my experiences running Engineers in Action and working on cleaning mining wastewater in that area, I know that unfortunately, the mines run by the co-ops are just as poorly run now as they were in the past by the patrons in the bad old days, and much worse than the larger mines currently owned by the Criollo or the international mining companies. The government now has laws that require domestic and foreign-owned mining companies to have much improved safety equipment and practices, although I know of cases where large companies have bribed and gotten around many of the regulations. But in general, there are good laws on mining safety in place, and the government is hopefully inspecting and requiring most mining companies to actually follow the miner safety regulations. And they pay their miners much, 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 much better. Clearly, mine workers working for a foreign-owned or even Criollo-owned mine are better paid and have a safer working environment than the co-op-owned mines. But the co-ops and their miners have become such a strong political power in the last 20 years, there are very few regulations on their mining techniques and virtually no enforcement of the few laws that there are on the books. It is still a deadly business. There are 15,000 Indigenous miners working for co-ops inside Cerro Rico. Their average life expectancy is still only 40 years old. While the cooperative owners can make a living wage or a little better if the price of minerals is high enough, they often pay as little as $1 a day to hired workers, some maybe $2 a day. Cave-ins and silicosis pneumonia are still frequent events. And the poverty in Bolivia is such that even children as young as 12 work at the mines, although the co-ops are careful to give them the safer jobs on the surface, mostly pushing carts and shoveling the loose rock at the surface. And there are mining cooperatives run like that all over Bolivia. Why do the cooperatives pay so little and don't do safety measures? I suspect it's primarily because they are all working in mines that have been abandoned by regular mining companies, and those mines are no longer economically viable. So no one is making much money off of them. That is, except those who are buying the minerals from the co-ops and shipping it somewhere else to be refined and sold. They make good money. And the mining cooperatives are strong enough to stop the government from shutting down the mines that can't afford the cost of safety and better pay. So why do people still work in the mines at barely subsistent wages, knowing that they will probably die by the age of 40? It's because they often cannot find another job anywhere. They need work. They need to work to have enough to feed themselves and their family. And the co-ops pay just barely enough to survive. What is needed is better paying jobs doing something, anything, that is safer than mining. The one solution that the government is doing now that it didn't do before 2006 is education. Today, there's a strong attempt to provide education for Indigenous children throughout Bolivia, although older children in Potosi and in the mining areas still drop out to work in the mines to help feed their family. Now there's a new threat. Cerro Rico is so honeycombed with tunnels that don't have any support, that the mountain as a whole is collapsing. I first read that this was a strong possibility as far back as the year 2000. The first big collapse that went all the way to the surface occurred in 2009. Several such collapses have happened since. If you compare pictures from the past to the present, you can see that Cerro Rico is beginning to slump. It's hard to comprehend how this country, which provided the potato that fed so much of the hunger of the world and increased the caloric intake of millions of Europeans and others around the world, it's hard to understand how it finds itself hungry. And this mine, which produced the first true international currency, which led to an explosion of trade and wealth around the world, now stars its own miners. And the mines collapse on them and on their children, and they die of silicosis pneumonia. And Bolivia has become one of the poorest countries of the Western Hemisphere. It's primarily because of the theft by the conquistadors and their descendants, and later from the continuing exploitation of Bolivian resources by the great international corporations of the United States and of the world. So we now add more threads to our Bolivian aguayo. Running throughout the history, the aguayo of Bolivia is the huge, bright, shiny thread of silver. It's a thread so beautiful, so large, that the world is a better, wealthier place because that thread exists. But around the edges and underneath that thread of silver, there is a tarnish and an ugly corrosion. It is a tarnish of Bolivian wealth being stolen and exploited by other countries. It is a corrosion of 8 million men dying inside the mountain that eats men. And we could add smaller, less significant threads to our aguayo, which would tell a similar story, but on a much smaller basis than the thread of silver. You would find threads made of gold, zinc, lead, tin, copper, tungsten, sulfur, potassium, borax, and semi-precious stones, each adding beauty and or strength or wealth to the world, but each precious metal or industrial mineral being mined and removed for a fraction of what it's worth and exported to another country to create wealth. Perhaps you're beginning to see the Bolivian blanket, the Bolivian aguayo, as I see it. A country of incredible beauty and wealth. A country which should be as wealthy as Switzerland or even richer. If you look closely, you can see the wealth running through the aguayo. But when you look at it today, it is undoubtedly a rough and worn-out looking blanket, its beauty stripped by the foreigners who came in and stole its wealth. Perhaps I should have entitled this episode, Cerro Rico, the mountain that continues to eat men and their boys. I realize that I've said some controversial things in this podcast broadcast. I want to be absolutely clear about this. The opinions I've shared in this podcast broadcast are my opinions and my opinions only. They absolutely do not necessarily represent the opinions of the Iglesia Evangelica Metodista in Bolivia, the United Methodist Church, or anyone else for that matter. They come from my experiences in Bolivia, my time as Executive Director of Engineers in Action while we were working with mine owners in the Potosi area trying to clean up a highly polluted river, and from my research from highly credible news outlets. There are those who are pushing me to not be too controversial. However, I'm old, and I'm retired, and I am planning on saying what I see happen and what is happening in Bolivia. If you will go to the website at www.weavingtheblanket.com or www.tiendoelaguayo.com, you will find the Dig Deeper episode number 4 button. It will take you to a page that has several well-done articles on the plight and the work of Cerro Rico. You will also find a list of my sources for this episode. And please go to our website at www.weavingtheblanket.com for more information about this podcast. I'm also looking for nominations for life stories of other Bolivian Methodists to include in this podcast broadcast series. If you know someone whose life story you feel is powerful and should be shared, please go to the website at www.weavingtheblanket.com and click on the button entitled Nominations. As always, I want to thank Juan Carlos Cordero and his family for singing the opening hymn and the recorded flute music in the episode, and of course for his work in translation and narration of Tiendo El Aguayo, and for his advice. Our next podcast broadcast will be the last of the Bolivian reality backdrop and foundational threads to our Aguayo. It's entitled, Life as a Peon in the Hacienda Days, Enslaved, Starved, and Abused by the Patrons. Don't forget that you can blog, ask questions, make comments, add your 2 cents worth about this episode at the website www.weavingtheblanket.com.